Welcome to the Invero Show. Join the Invero team and our esteemed clients and partners as we demystify the complexities of Microsoft Cloud systems. We hope to help you accelerate your cloud journey and maximize the value of your investment with Microsoft. And now, on with the show.
I think I've met many or most of you here, but for anyone that I haven't met before, I'm Sean Ambrose, the Chief Revenue Officer here at Invero, and I'm joined with my esteemed colleagues, Stephanie Ekmick and Ian Heron. And really, this is going to be the Stephanie show because she's going to spend the bulk of the time here on Microsoft licensing updates. So without further ado, let's jump in. What I'm going to tackle here, and I do this at the beginning of every one of these, is why is this worth learning about? And obviously there was something compelling for you to say, hey, I'm going to jump on this call, but I'll just kind of anchor that a little bit and then just put a little context of how does it fit into what is it that Invero does overall. Then it's going to be the main event. This is where, Steph and I were joking, pardon me for my cheesy joke here, but that, you got the whole seat, but you're just going to need the edge of it here. Stephanie's going to talk about what's going on in Microsoft licensing land and updates and changes and new suites and add-ons and what's happening in Azure world for new cost optimization approaches, and then just some overall trends that are going on within Microsoft as they've rolled into their new fiscal year 2025, and even some of the things that are starting to percolate into what's likely going to show up in calendar year 2025. So in terms of why is this learning about, and I think this is pretty obvious and intuitive, everybody, is Microsoft licensing is complicated. And it's a lot. We're so grateful for Steph to be part of the team in Invero because she loves this. She's fantastic at it, and she spends a lot of time learning about, okay, what's changing, because it is not static. It is constantly changing. And we often joke about how you need a PhD in this stuff to stay on top of it. But staying on top of it is the difference between leakage and efficiency, right? And so Steph's going to go through that in a deep way. In terms of how does this fit into Invero's go-to-market? So some of you may have seen this before. If you have, great. And if you haven't, I'll just take a second here of, when I think about Invero's why do we exist? What's our purpose? It shows up here at the bottom of this slide here of we wake up every day and think about how do we help our clients maximize the value of their investment in Microsoft. If you are a Microsoft shop, it means that generally speaking, Microsoft is in your top 3 expenditures in your IT budget. And so therefore, anything that kind of bubbles up there, you've got that requirement to make sure that you're getting good value for money. Next is, well, how do we go about that? And that's up on the top left here of this is what we do. We focus on Microsoft and complementary or adjacent technology, but we don't really focus on things that are kind of competing to that. It allows us to get really deep into it. And then secondly, and this is the main event of this show, is we've built out an expert level Microsoft licensing practice because we believe that licensing fits within architecture. They sit side by side in terms of the decisions and the road mapping and the thinking that each of you do in your business as it pertains to how you make all this Microsoft stuff work to the best that it can. And then ultimately into more of the what of how does this fit? Well, right in the middle of this slide, you see Microsoft licensing. It's absolutely core to what we do. So sure, okay, it fits there, but exactly to the point I was making, but we're going to talk about Fabric and Power BI. So that actually kind of fits into our data analytics practice in a way of how we help clients there. We're going to be talking about Teams and the overall productivity portfolio and the changes there. So that really ties into our modern work practice, how we help clients there. I mentioned earlier, we're going to talk about Azure and some of the changes there in terms of cost savings and management. So that really ties in here, which also kind of lights up this overall cost optimization thinking. We're going to touch on security and some of the things how that fits into the E5 and what does or doesn't and different ways to think about that. So that shows up there. And then last but not least is this EA licensing strategy and advisory. We are, as you see to the left of that, we're a direct CSP partner. So we do that business with lots of clients. We are not what's called an LSP, but nonetheless, we provide a significant amount of guidance there. And that's a big part of what Steph's going to unpack here is whether you're on an EA or CSP, she's going to help you understand the different changes and impacts. So when we think about how does this fit into our go-to-market, basically it fits everywhere. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Steph, and we're going to start with some general updates and changes to some of the existing licensing packages. So Steph, with that, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. So, like Sean just said, I'm going to start with just a couple almost like housekeeping items, just things that I thought might be helpful to mention as there are some upcoming updates. So, come October 1st, any of your users that sign into the Azure portal, your Entra Admin Center or your Intune Admin Center will need MFA. And they're also going to enforce MFA for any sign-in to any Azure tools in January. I've had a couple of people reach out and ask if this is going to be for all users. I haven't seen anything indicating that Microsoft will be enforcing MFA for every user, just your admin users. So look forward to that, I guess. I feel like a lot of my customers would already have MFA for their IT staff, so that shouldn't be too impactful. If that is something that's a concern to you, just reach out, let me know, and we can talk about some of the options for MFA. There are some light and some free options there as well. So another big change, so this one was actually announced April 1st, and the same day it was announced, it was put into place, which is kind of unusual for Microsoft. They do usually give a bit of notice, but what Microsoft did was for new customers specifically, you are no longer able to buy an M365 bundle that includes Teams for M365 E3 and E5. It's still going to be available for your F SKUs, and for the small business licenses, those are still applicable to be coming in with Teams included. It's just those bigger E3, E5 level ones. And this is really a change that was driven by some laws in the European regions around competition. Some of the Teams competitors were complaining that it just wasn't fair if Teams came in it, because then there's really no reason anyone would use anything but Teams. So in response to that, Microsoft has pulled it out and then enforced that globally. One thing that is kind of interesting to note about that, it is not going to impact new customers. You'll be able to renew licenses with that Teams included in your bundle. But there's a couple tricks to mention there. If you are moving, for example, from an enterprise agreement into a CSP agreement, that is considered a new customer. And so that is an implication to keep an eye on, is how that's going to play out if you're going to switch agreement types. There is that Teams enterprise license that gets added on as an extra license to go with it for the users that do need Teams. Again, if you have existing licenses, it really shouldn't impact you. And then the other thing to note that if you do have a CSP agreement, one way that Microsoft is getting around this impacting existing CSP customers is by allowing transfers of end user licensing from one CSP partner to another, similar to how Azure transfers work for CSP. So that is really just to avoid any of that complication of if you move to a new provider, does that make you a new customer? We can just get around that with the transfer. Next little thing to note, some of the Dynamics licenses are going to face a price increase in October 1st. Business Central is not impacted. And like all of these price increases and licensing changes, if you are locked into an existing agreement, that won't impact you until your agreement is up for renewal. One other interesting thing to note is that they've updated the definition of an external user in the product terms. It's going to be effective October 1st. It's really just clearly defining contractors, and when they are considered an external user, this could have some licensing implications for you, because there are use rights that are tied to external users that just won't come into play when it's considered an internal user. Things like SharePoint access, Teams. There's some use rights for external users that could be impacted. And so the changes are really just defining contractors as somebody who is not dedicated pretty much just to your environment. I think it even sets out how many hours a week they can be a contractor for you over the long term. So keep an eye on that if you are utilizing external user licensing rights. And I feel like everyone is pretty sick of Copilot, so I promise there are only just a couple quick mostly peripheral references to Copilot this whole presentation, but I would like to warn my CSP customers that Microsoft has said there will be new self-service purchase options for Copilot that your end users will see. And that's going to be rolling out starting in October. And what that's going to look like is just some buttons as your users are going through their daily life. There's going to be some more buttons of like add Copilot. So if they're using just the free Copilot, asking it questions, or some scenarios like that. So keep an eye on that if you're really not interested in your end users going through that self-service motion with their credit cards. Shoot me a note and we can figure out how to get that locked down and not applicable to your environment. One thing that's really important to me is making sure that all of my customers are fully aware of what they own and they are using as much of that as possible. That goes back to our go-to-market strategy of getting the most out of your investment with Microsoft. So I feel like most of these logos should be pretty familiar. A lot of these are really, these are just all the applications in the M365 bundle. That is the E3. And the majority of these also show up in the business premium offering for small business as well. But a couple things to note in here. So the ones I've highlighted yellow, Microsoft does a really great job of throwing little pieces of functionality into all of these bundles to get your users used to it, interested in it, get a little flavor for it. But there's also a lot to be said for making sure that you are utilizing everything you can and eliminating as much licensing wastage as possible by trying to figure out if what you already own will meet your needs. So I highlighted Visio. What that actually is Visio for M365. And so it's a really light web-based version of Visio that is going to be included for Business Premium, for your E3, for your E5 users. And it's going to hopefully, if you have that use case of HR, just, oh, I really need to make that flow chart. I really need to make that org chart. Maybe just direct them and see if the Visio for M365 will meet their needs. Maybe you can reduce some of those Visio licenses. The other two, Power Apps and Power Automate, again, for the majority of M365 bundles, including the small business ones, the frontline worker plans, a lot of them include some of that light usage of Power Apps and Power Automate. Microsoft made the licensing options for their Power Platform very complicated. There's about 4 or 5 different ways to license all of this stuff. So I highly recommend before you go forward and buy some of those expensive premium licenses, just take a look at what's included in your existing license bundles and see if maybe something in there would fit, if you can just really reduce that need to add more licenses. There's capacity based, there's per user, there's per flow. There's so many different options, but definitely worth taking a look and spending some time just to make sure that you are getting the kind of the lowest level of premium licenses that you can get away with to meet your needs. So that's kind of the existing pieces that are in there that I wanted to call out. If there's any kind of questions about any of that, let me know. But the 4 along the bottom that I've made bigger, those are some of the more recent changes. I will specifically call out that Loop is only available in E3 and E5 right now, but what Microsoft is really doing here is adding some more of those collaboration tools with the idea that if you need some of that functionality, maybe you can get rid of a third-party product to your environment. Maybe you can standardize on some of these Microsoft solutions. If they're already included, it could be a huge cost savings if you have other collaboration tools or some of that light project management requirements. So Planner is the rebranding of some of the project functionality. Microsoft kind of threw tasks and Planner and a couple other productivity tools. And so they created Planner there's some light functionality in the M365 bundles, but Project Plan 1 has been rebranded into Planner Plan 1. Really fun to say, super fun to Google. You get all sorts of just generic things with all of these generic names that Microsoft has come up with. So really just take a look and see if some of that functionality through To-Do and Planner can meet some of those needs. And Loop is actually a really great little tool. It has all these components that you can add to all sorts of other Microsoft workloads through these Loop components. We've started using it internally because one of my customers asked me what they should use it for and what use case it should be brought up with. And so I was like, maybe we should start using it just to make sure we actually understand that. It's a pretty slick tool. I recommend giving it a look. And then Clipchamp is a nice little video editing tool in there. I've grayed out Teams just to really highlight that there are going to be bundles that don't come with Teams going forward. But honestly, that might actually fit in nicely if you do have users that don't need Teams, or you have another solution for Teams, for example. But so really the messaging or the idea here is it's really important to understand all of the things you own so that you aren't buying other solutions and have, I remember when oil and gas heyday, and I did a review with one of my oil and gas customers, and they had 4 different solutions to edit PDFs, including a native Microsoft one. And so sometimes things just kind of get out of control. So definitely take a look at what applications you have in your environment and maybe see if you can replace them with some Microsoft ones.
Hey, Steph, I'll just ask, this is great. Loop, you touched on it a couple times there. And yeah, thanks to you, we're using Loop more in innovative ways within Invero. Any thoughts on what other pieces of software clients could consider decommissioning if they were to adopt Loop?
Yeah, so some of the competitors to Loop are Asana, Confluence with Jira, Trello, and Notion. Those are kind of the most popular ones that I think Microsoft is really trying to replace.
Yeah, so if you got any of those in your environment, and Loop might be a reasonable alternative, it's worth exploring, and then you could turn down something else and save yourself some money because you're not paying more for Loop. It's already in.
All right, so one other big change that it could be really impactful to some customers is the Power BI premium capacity-based licensing. Any customers that are already using that, you won't be allowed to renew that after January 1st. So if you're locked into a big EA and you just started it, you don't have to really deal with this until your EA is coming to an end. If you're on a CSP, an annual or a monthly lock-in, those will definitely be impacted by this. And so keeping an eye on when your licenses are set to expire will be helpful to figure out when this will impact you. But essentially, after the start of the year, you won't be able to renew those premium capacity licenses in Azure. Instead, the Microsoft replacement is Fabric. And so Fabric is a new kind of SaaS offering from Microsoft to help organize your data in the cloud. It's a pretty slick solution. It does take a bit of setup, and there's a lot of components to it. You can see by this beautiful Microsoft graphic that I've included, but it's really the rebranding and repackaging of a few existing pieces of functionality in Azure with some additional ones. And so it's really intended to be that single place to access all of your data. And every user that is part of Fabric is going to have their own workspace, and it's going to look and feel a lot like OneDrive. They're calling it One Lake. And so as customers are starting to use Fabric, if you are moving from that premium capacity Power BI license, there will be some action required of reassigning those workspaces to Fabric. As a licensing specialist, it's going to be real easy for me to tell you, seems simple. But in honesty, I'm actually not sure because I'm just not that technical user that's going to be going through and doing that. And there definitely will be some cost implications to moving to Fabric. It's a different model than the Power BI Premium Capacity license. The Fabric nodes are going to act a lot more like a virtual machine kind of a model. Reservations are going to be available. There's a whole bunch of different sizes. If you are replacing the Power BI Premium and what you were using it for is the Power BI Pro distribution license model, where you can not licensed Power BI Pro and just distribute all those dashboards, then what you're going to look at is the F64 or above Fabric node, because that's where those licenses start to come in. And oh, Microsoft just made this very complicated. I've had a few customers reach out with licensing questions, and um, it's just not very straightforward. Usually we loop in one of our technical resources to even help support that conversation, because it just ends up being so
Well,
complicated.
Steph, to your point there, like we're actually, you'll see later on in the deck here, we're going to dedicate one of our upcoming Invero shows to Fabric, because it's so comprehensive. There's so many moving parts. And so maybe just to add to what you're saying here is if this is on your mind, like give us a call and let's talk it through, right? Because there's a lot to think about from a licensing standpoint, but also a technology standpoint. Like, does it fit? Is it going to give me the benefit that I'm looking for? So just like Steph's upper game here, understand the license part, we've done similarly here on the technical side to make sure that we can represent. We're helping different clients right now implement Fabric, but probably more importantly, help people figure out what the heck is it? Do I need it? Why? How do I license it? So yeah, it's a big topic. Obviously, we're just kind of skimming this here, but if anybody wants to talk further, give us a call and we'll unpack this even further.
Yeah, I feel like I've already lost a couple days of my life on YouTube videos trying to figure out Fabric. But yeah, exactly. Reach out. Our team is doing all of that digging for you guys.
So now we're going to shift into the next segment here of kind of the newer stuff. Everything that we just chatted about before, it all existed, but it was just more of some of the small or significant changes. Now this is more about new suites and new add-ons that are coming. So Steph, back over to you to start with the Entra ID suite.
Yeah, so one thing that's kind of interesting, Microsoft, I feel like for years, put every new high level piece of functionality that they came out with, just threw it into the E5. And I can't even tell you how many value of E5 conversations I've had over the past 5 or 6 years. So with some of these new suites, they're actually not part of E5. They don't even have E5 as the prerequisite for them. A lot of these have licensing prerequisites that are the E3 level and business premium level. And what's actually kind of interesting too is for a lot of these products that offer the bundle and the standalone, there are separate and less expensive versions of them for front workers as well. So there's just a ton of add-ons and step-ups, and it's not part of the E5 anymore. So kind of interesting where Microsoft is going with this, but Entra ID Suite is a really good example of this. A lot of this just became generally available this summer, so it's a pretty recent bundle. So the top 3 pieces of it, those ones you can buy standalone, or if you buy the Entra ID Suite, you're going to get all 5 of these pieces. So the private access, that's going to replace some of those legacy VPNs. It's going to provide secure access to your on-prem apps and resources for your users. And then hand in hand with that is that internet access piece, which is going to protect the access to your SaaS applications and websites. And that's actually going to end up, you can push out conditional access policies to really any website, even if you're not federated with them, through that internet access piece. The Entra ID governance, that's where you're going to manage identity and access life cycles of your users. So you can automate some of that access, and it's going to tie into your HR systems just to make that smoother, easier, automated. Then you have your Entra ID protection, which is the only piece in here that has overlap with the Entra ID P2, which is in the M365 E5. The rest of this seems to be complementary, a little bit of overlap, but mostly complementary functionality to the E5. But that Entra ID protection, that's where you're going to be able to detect, investigate, and remediate those identity-based risks with automation. So things like password spray attacks, leak credentials, it's going to help protect against that kind of stuff. And then that, the verified ID piece, that's going to enforce some facial recognition based on government ID pictures. So all of that together is going to just really increase the identity management and security of your users' identifications and things like that. There's a couple other extra pieces that aren't part of the suite and that are available standalone, and it's because they are not licensed per user, which is why they aren't part of it. So that workload ID, that's going to be conditional access policies applied directly to workloads. So you would license that per workload when they require some premium features. And then the permissions management, it's a cloud infrastructure entitlement management solution that is also going to manage permissions in other clouds. So similar to what PIM is doing for Azure, this will also manage those permissions for Google Cloud or AWS, for example. So these are all, yeah, like these seem like great solutions if that is a gap in your environment. The whole suite together, the Microsoft like suggested retail pricing for that whole suite is about $16 a user a month. So it's not cheap. And those standalone licenses, the IT or the ID governance, that one's like almost $10 a user a month, and the other ones are closer to $7, the private access and the internet access. So these can be pretty pricey if you need them for your entire like user count kind of a thing.
Yeah, thanks, Steph. I think what we're seeing here, there's a theme, right, of that. Seems like back in the day when we thought about our clients and kind of them figuring out what's the best way to license core Microsoft areas, it was really about what bundle and what discount. And elements of that are still absolutely valid today, but it's more about things are so a la carte and piecemeal that it's really important now to figure out what do we really need here? What could we maybe use a lesser version of to try and optimize that? Because it's no longer about, oh, I'll just take the big bundle or the medium bundle and I'm good. It's more complicated than that.
Yeah, absolutely. Like conversations about value of the E5 used to be like, okay, you have at least one security solution. Okay, you might use a
Right.
compliance piece. Oh, you need this and that. All right, it's an easy conversation. E5 will be worth it. But I think there's a lot more work that can be done in the future because they are introducing a lot of these very specific functionality pieces. And so with this overlap and complementary sort of actions with the E5, it's just going to be important to really drill down and figure out, oh, what are we actually going to use? Is there another solution? There's always 3 or 4 ways to accomplish things with Microsoft.
Yeah, exactly. All right, we'll go into Intune here.
Yeah, so Intune's been around forever. I think Intune was actually released in 2010. But this Intune Suite, a lot of these pieces are new. And so Microsoft actually announced the Intune Suite about a year and a half ago, but they've been adding things to it even throughout 2024. And you can see there's actually a few options here. There's an Intune Plan 2, there's an Intune Full Suite, and then some of these are actually available just standalone. And so again, keeping with that theme, like there's a lot of overlap and complementary features with E5. It's just a bit of a different focus and definitely looking at some the device management focus specifically. So the endpoint management, it's actually keeping in some of those the PIM related ideas of just-in-time access and elevated admin access for a short period of time. And so what that privileged management does for endpoints and for your end users is you can set up rules or like automatic approvals or some things like that for elevated access under very specific parameters. And then it will end up automating some of those requests to save some time for your IT team. The enterprise app management, that's going to add in like that enterprise application catalog idea to your environment, and then it will just streamline your app management. The advanced analytics, that's where you can proactively detect and resolve endpoint issues. It's just going to streamline your troubleshooting. The remote help, that's like TeamViewer. I actually find that the remote help is a pretty expensive solution for a standalone. That by itself is like almost $5 a user a month. And the person providing the support and the person receiving the support both need that license. So I find a lot of these Microsoft products are great for displacing a third-party product in your environment if you already own the Microsoft solution. Like if you love the Intune Suite and you buy it and you need it for a whole bunch of other things, maybe then replace TeamViewer. But I don't know that remote help is a cost-effective solution just to buy standalone, to be perfectly honest. And then some of these other pieces, so that the tunnel for the mobile application management, that is intended for mobile or for, sorry, users and devices that aren't enrolled in Intune. So it could be like a personal device or something like that that a user has, but it's when you don't have those devices in Intune and you can't manage them that way, this is just going to secure the access for those devices to your on-prem applications. The cloud PKI, that's just their public key infrastructure solution. Firmware over-the-air update, that's kind of self-explanatory. Push out remote firmware updates. And then that specialized device management, that's to help manage like VR headsets, large like display screens, things like that, just things that aren't necessarily being managed really well with Intune right now. So that's the Intune Suite. The full suite, just over $13 per user per month if you're going to license that standalone, or sorry, if you're going to license the suite. The plan 2 by itself is about $550, and then the pieces that are available standalone, there's a pretty wide range actually of the prices. So the public key infrastructure is like $3, and then they range from like the enterprise app management is also about that $3 mark. The privileged management is $4. Remote help, yeah, that's almost $5 a user a month. And then the advanced analytics piece is about $7.
Yeah, let's we'll keep it rolling here. We're going to chat a little bit here about SharePoint Premium and 365 Archive.
Yeah, so this is another kind of interesting addition. I think the SharePoint Premium offering is still a bit of a work in progress. I think they're still developing it. So what they did is they are taking services from the SharePoint syntax, and it's starting with that SharePoint Advanced Management Cal, and they're going to rebrand that as SharePoint Premium. So the SharePoint Advanced Management Cal right now, that's a per user license, and it's going to help. Like I said, with some of these things, there does seem to be quite a bit of overlap with the E5 functionality. This is going to do some of that purview related stuff, but geared just towards your SharePoint. So there is that content lifecycle management piece. That's a bit of an overlap with purview. There is that it's going to help you manage your content sprawl, but it's also really introduced here to kind of manage some of the risks that Copilot is going to introduce with your document oversharing and access there. But it will also integrate pretty nicely with the M365 archiving solution, which is a new offering that Microsoft just released in the last couple of months as well, to archive SharePoint sites to save money on that storage cost. So for most customers, your SharePoint storage amounts, you start with the terabyte. For a lot of your end user licensing, each licensed user is going to add about 10 gigs per month. A lot of my customers just don't find that's a sufficient amount of storage for their SharePoint environment online. And so they end up adding a lot of those extra, like the extra gigs of storage, which are like 27 cents per gig per month. So when you're getting into needing an additional 10 terabytes, it gets pretty pricey. So what Microsoft has introduced is the ability to send some of those sites to like an Azure archive tier of storage. And so there is some setup involved to point it correctly to your Azure subscription and all of that. But as you can see, it's about a quarter of the cost per gig on that archive level versus the SharePoint production environment. And so you could absolutely save quite a bit of money if you have a lot of data that you need to keep around, but don't necessarily access very often. The trick here is that rehydrating that data is going to have to be done for the full site. So you would archive the site and you would rehydrate the full site. And those hydration costs are like 80 cents per gig per month. So it's like 3 times what the SharePoint storage costs are of that one-time cost to rehydrate it. So the rule of thumb there is that as long as you aren't rehydrating 30% of that archive data or more per year, you will save money on those costs.
Yeah, thanks, Steph. So I think it's probably worth an analysis and for each client to try and figure that out, right? Because if you get it wrong, those hydration costs are pretty pricey. So then it could spiral up. So it requires a bit of that analysis to figure out how do we think this is going to play out?
Yeah, and there's some good information already in SharePoint, so you can definitely pull up information on when a site was last accessed and things like that. When you combine that SharePoint Advanced Management functionality with the archiving, that's going to allow you to then put in place like automated recommendations for these archiving based on set parameters of, okay, if no one's touched this in X number of months or days or whatever, then have it notify me and I can take a look at archiving it. Or you can just set it to like straight archive things based on those parameters. So the SharePoint Advanced Management will help automate a lot of this. A lot of these higher level features and functions that we talked about in all of these suites will introduce a lot of that automation to existing functionality, which could save your IT team just a lot of time. But then you have that look of, okay, well, if we're trying to save money on SharePoint costs, and we are saving money by using archiving, then we have to add in the cost of the advanced management to make this work. Is that actually going to be cost effective? So that's kind of the consideration there.
All right, lots to figure out there, and certainly worthy of follow-on conversations if anybody's interested. Let's jump into Teams. Steph has touched on Teams a couple times here. There's a lot going on here.
Yeah,
Give us an
and
update.
I mean, saying this is a new bundle is definitely a bit incorrect and disingenuous, but there's just, it's hard to talk about add-ons and complicated Microsoft introductions without really talking about Teams licensing, because I used to start so many conversations and Teams info sessions of, hey, there's 4 important add-ons that you need to know about. And now look at all of these add-ons. Each one of these is a different add-on license. And so I kind of try to split them out into collaboration licenses versus enterprise voice licenses, just because there is so much for Teams right now. The price list that I have, like there's hundreds of lines of Teams licenses these days. Like it's just getting a little bit out of control. So in order to really adopt Teams as a full collaboration and enterprise voice solution, it's getting more complicated just to make sure that you have everything you need and you're keeping an eye on all of these licensing pieces. So as Teams gets pulled out of the bundles, that's where that Teams Essentials and Teams Enterprise licensing is going to come in. Teams Exploratory, that's actually a free license that was thrown into a lot of people's tenants when they didn't have users that had Teams licenses. And so Microsoft just threw that in there for them to use. You can see some of these are bolded, and those are the ones that are $0 licenses. So not all of these are hugely expensive, but they all do have a different purpose. And so it can be really helpful to just understand what's doing what. So Teams Essentials, Enterprise, Exploratory, that's just the base Teams licensing that you have options for. Teams Premium is an interesting one in that the purpose behind Teams Premium is to add more functionality for Teams meetings. So you can brand things. It's going to beef up some of the features for those big webinar related town hall meetings kind of thing. But there's one interesting piece of overlap in Teams Premium that overlaps with Copilot for M365. And so you can actually get some of that meeting recap and the intelligent AI related features for summarizing and to-do lists for Teams specifically through Teams Premium. So if the price of Copilot is feeling pretty exorbitant to you, and really if your users are like, but the Teams meeting recap, I need that, yet, maybe take a look at Teams Premium. And the other thing about Teams Premium, and actually like all of the other things that I've kind of mentioned, is they all have trial licenses available. Copilot for M365 does not, but maybe if you want to get a feel for how that looks specifically in Teams, set up a Teams Premium trial. That might be kind of a nice way forward. The Teams Room Basic and the Teams Room Pro, those are to manage your Teams devices, like those big boardroom setups. And those are actually bundles of functionality that include Intune and Teams phone system licenses and some of that kind of stuff. So if you have that need and you're just not really sure, just reach out and we can talk about which license would be appropriate and what you need to really manage those devices. Same with Teams Shared Device. And that used to be called like a common area phone. It was really just to add that like the Teams calling ability onto some like publicly accessible or shared phones, basically. The audio conferencing, that should be free for everybody. If you're paying for audio conferencing, please reach out and let's figure that part out. The Teams phone app, also free, but it is an extra license that you might need added on if your users need to access things through the phone app. And then we finally get to some of that enterprise voice functionality. So in order to really have Teams as your full telephony solution, you're going to need that phone standard license. And you're going to need that if it's through Operator Connect or direct routing. That's part of E5, but there's also some through the CSP agreements. There's also some really nice bundled options for that phone standard license with a calling plan. So the phone standard license is all of those PBX phone functionality pieces, and then the calling plan is what's going to give you the calling minutes and the rights to get a phone number set up. But there's definitely a lot of options in there. So it's just getting complicated and confusing, and it's really hard to figure out which phone calling plans you actually need, and really which of these add-ons you need in general. There's pay-go options as well, so you can add, it's a couple dollars a month per user, and then every single call they make will draw a charge rather than drawing down from a specific set of minutes. But in most of the reviews I've done for customers, the users just aren't using the minutes that they have to any sort of amount to make it worth it. So in a lot of cases, splitting it up between maybe a domestic plan and maybe some pay-go calling plans is going to end up being a lot more cost effective for an enterprise voice solution. And then you have resource accounts and communications credits. So again, resource accounts, those are, it's a free license, but it's an important piece of functionality that you're going to need added on in there. And just keeping an eye on some of these add-ons and understanding what they are is going to be hugely helpful for making sure that things are working properly. Communications credits are really that way to pay for any overages, and also pretty important to get set up.
Yeah, thanks, Steph. I know when we prepped on this and we were chatting a lot lately about 365 Copilot and how there's kind of mixed demand, I guess, on a global scale there. But it does seem like the number one feature that people seek out of 365 Copilot is all of the transcription and all the summarization and everything that comes within Teams. So if that's the number one feature and everything else you're not so sure about, there's a lower cost option to get there. And then to your point there around enterprise voice, what you help me understand is if you don't have this right and you use Teams as your telephony strategy, calls might end. Like calls just might not work. Like not only is it about efficiency and savings, but it's also about making it work. Because if you were to get it wrong, like literally a call could happen and then it just stops because you ran out of minutes.
Yeah, if you don't have those communications credits set up to draw from, if you go over your minutes, it could definitely lead to just nothingness, just calls being dropped. The good thing is Microsoft does have a nice report you can pull for PSTN usage, but it's a really complicated report. There's actually a full Microsoft Learn site that really just goes into how to navigate that report. It's kind of a lot.
Yeah. So lots to take in here. Let's move off of Teams and let's move into Azure. So now we're going to chat a bit about some of the updates here in terms of, as we talked about earlier, all of this, but for sure Azure. We spent so much time here on how this is constantly changing and evolving, and not only the license programs, but the technology itself. And then the technology is they release new capability, and then that impacts licensing. So Steph's going to walk through some of the updates here that can help you folks think about how do you drive more efficiencies in your overall Azure spend.
Yeah, and I mean, Azure Cost Management is something I've spent a ton of time over the last year really digging into. How can we save money without making any changes to your environment is a hot topic and something that I'm definitely focusing a lot on. But as far as that cost management goes, there's been a couple interesting updates just to be aware of. If you're running multi-clouds and you have a really hard time with navigating some of that reporting and making those reports work together to figure out where your total spend is, there's now going to be some new reporting with new formats for Azure that will standardize with other cloud reporting. It's called Focus is the new format. And another thing to note, so the 6th generation of some of the virtual machines are now in preview. You can save a huge amount of money on, like, without even throwing a reservation or a savings plan on it, just by upgrading from like a version 2 to a version 5, you can save like 20 or 30% on the compute costs for that. And the newer versions are just more efficient and more cost effective. One interesting thing that Microsoft has released and announced is a centralized management method for your SQL Server licenses. So you can actually upload information from your enterprise agreement of your SQL Server licenses, and then Microsoft through Azure will just automatically apply those licenses to the most to your SQL virtual machines. It will also track when those licenses are set to expire so that you will have to take action to then add those A-Hub entitlements again. I thought that was a kind of interesting option for managing that. And just a couple of things about Azure Advisor. So Azure Advisor is not going to show you that total savings amount anymore at the end of the month. There was a lot of confusion and concern and just frustration from that. It would recommend savings plans in our eyes for the same workloads and then add that up and present that as a total cost savings that was available, which was not true. It just doesn't work like that. There's a lot of overlap in that number. So they're just going to get rid of that total just to save on that. And then another note about Azure Advisor, I highly recommend utilizing Azure Advisor and popping in there to take a look at some of the recommendations. But there's a section for workbooks, and there's a couple of workbooks in preview that are pretty helpful, in my opinion. There's one for cost optimization that can give you some ideas for even changes on the well-architected framework side of things. And then the other interesting workbook is going to show you all of the service retirements that are going to impact you. Microsoft is retiring things basically on a monthly basis, and keeping track of that is horrific. So this is just an easy way to pop in, open up that workbook, and it'll show you which of your specific services will be impacted on those dates. Just popping in there maybe once a quarter could be really helpful.
Yeah, thanks, Steph. So that's a good overview of what's going on and just some of the changes. There's so many changes here. Like we could spend a whole day on just kind of what's going on in Azure and changes, but hopefully this gives our audience some updates of just a handful of things that have changed. Let's shift to our last part here, which is really around Microsoft trends. And Steph's put together a pretty simple image because it's really more about the dialogue that she wants to share with you in terms of some trends that she's seeing and provide some insights there for all of you.
Yeah, sorry about this slide. I know both you and Ian complained about this to me.
That's
Telling me
great.
how awful it is. But I did steal this right from Microsoft. And I mean this has been their marketing campaign the last couple of years, is do more with less, which I mean it's a frustrating message, to be honest. Do more with less. Great. Thanks, Microsoft. But what that is actually going to end up looking like is some of the trends we've been seeing. Microsoft is standardizing pricing for a lot of these agreement types from EA level A, CSP, MPSA. So a lot of these level A agreements and some of the like initial entry points, the pricing is going to be the same, and discounting is going to be going away for a lot of customers. The trend over the past few years, as far as the LSP community goes, and the LSP are the partners that can sell enterprise agreements, the Microsoft is clawing away a lot of the fees, and we're hearing even more rumors about that. So I think there's going to it's going to lead to a lot of concern for customers around what's going to happen to your actual unit pricing as you come up for renewal on some of your agreements. The unit pricing is just going to keep going up and up. Discounting opportunities from Microsoft seem like they're going to be going away for a lot of smaller, like EA level A and B kind of customers. There's going to be a big push to go from EA into CSP type agreements in the future. And so as these things are happening, I think it's going to be more and more important for customers to take a deep look at what you're actually using, what you need, and really try and cut out any sort of waste from your licensing. It's going to be important to save money on that front, as well as trying to navigate the best unit price possible. But yeah, it's just going to be harder and harder to get discounts and get that unit price lower in the future.
Well, and to your point, there's probably more financial savings to be had on getting all of the subscription nuances right over what was historically just getting a better discount. That's
Yeah,
where that's where it's going to live.
And like if you're looking at the value of the E5, I mean, I feel like a lot of the things we've talked about already, if Power BI Pro usage is big in your environment, maybe flipping to Fabric will eliminate that license requirement for a lot of your users. And if not everyone is using Teams telephony, maybe throwing some bundles of calling plans and phone system licenses is a better fit for a subsection of your users. And so those are two of the big pieces of the E5 value. And like I think just really drilling down into what are we using? What are all the ways we can accomplish that or license that? How can we save money? Maybe the full E5 isn't the way to go in the future. I think there's going to be a lot more of those conversations.
Yeah, yeah, for sure, Steph. Anything more you want to touch on here before we close it out with next steps?
Yeah, I think it's going to be important to really make sure that you have just a handle on your licensing and the right kind of support people in place. Having a great licensing partner is definitely something that's going to be more and more important going forward.
Okay, yeah, for sure. And many of you, we are your licensing partner, and we're grateful for that, and thank you for that. And as you can see, this is Steph's passion, right? And the team behind her, the licensing team here behind her at Invero, this is what we do: is try and help you figure this out, get on top of it, and get the most efficient licensing structures and options possible for you. Which leads us to this next steps of, if any of these are of interest, like I got to talk more about it. Like, let's go have that conversation. Like, matter of fact, when we put this together, there's so much information. We could create a week-long seminar on updates, right? And we tried to reduce that down to about a 45-minute discussion here. And we tried to pick the high notes that we thought appeal to 80% people, kind of thing. But the fact is, each of you and your businesses have different requirements. And if any of this is of interest and you go, I want to dive deeper, give Steph a call, give me a call, give Ian a call, and we'll just set up obviously a no charge, just kind of one-on-one session with you and walk through what's important for you. But Steph, I know there's a few things that you wanted to highlight that you said maybe these are really important things for people to think about, talk about.
Yeah, like if you want to talk more about your licensing, if some of these things have sparked some interest or you have some concerns, like reach out. We can I can take a look at a bit of a licensing review. We can do some end user profiling, kind of working back from, okay, what do you actually need? And then let's split your users into different categories and then figure out what's the right bundle for each of them. Or if you're worried you don't have the right PSTN calling plans, pull a report. We can go through it together. I know that after one of our previous episodes of the Invero Show, after everything I said, I was like, just call me. And so you guys were kind of teasing me about sounding pretty thirsty. But honestly, it's just so important to me that everyone has the right licenses.
Bottom line, call Steph and we'll help you. And then, so thanks everybody for joining and listening on a license updates. Just maybe a little teaser here of what's coming next, because we're always thinking 1, 2, 3 shows ahead, how we can shape them for what we think the audience might be interested in. So just to give you a little preview there, our next episode coming up on Halloween actually is going to be all around Azure FinOps. Steph touched on this on one slide. There's so much to unpack here in terms of getting that right. So we're gonna dive into how do you operate your Azure environment like a finely tuned machine, licensing, architecture, and creating that overall kind of cost conscious culture around FinOps. We're going to dive into data classification and how do you think about getting your data ready for AI, whatever AI might mean to you. And that's a whole nother conversation of itself. And then we're already thinking into January here. Steph touched on Fabric a bunch of times here. We're going to have a session on, well, what's it going to do for me? How do I license it? How do I get started? But like, don't wait. If these conversations are of interest to you, we're fully prepared to have them now. We just can only do so many Invero shows kind of in a sequence, right? But we'd love to have these conversations with you at any time. That's the end. That's the end of this edition of the Invero Show. Thank you so much for joining. We appreciate your time and your business. Have a great day, everyone.